It took me a full minute to understand what I was looking at. 4 suitcases, 2 of them mine, and 2 I'd lent to Natalie months ago, stood upright in a perfect line next to the front porch, like loyal dogs waiting for orders. Each one was zipped, tight, handles facing the street. The site was so oddly precise that for a moment, I thought maybe the airline had dropped them off by mistake. Then I saw the note. Tucked beneath the top handle of my navy Samsonite, a single sheet of white. Paper fluttered slightly in the Seattle breeze. If you want to stay here, the garden shed has been prepared. Love, Natalie. My knees nearly gave out. The taxi driver was still unloading the last bag when I stepped forward, plucked the note with shaking fingers, and reread it, once, twice, trying to process the words. It didn't feel real. I had only been gone 5 days, a short trip to visit my cousin in Napa Valley, a trip that, until now, had seemed like a much-needed breather from the slow, silent strain that had been building at home. I'd laughed, drunk wine, talked about my late husband without tears. I'd even started thinking about repainting the kitchen. I hadn't known I was planning to come back to a war zone. I looked up at the house, the one with the robin egg, blue shutters I painted by hand. The windows were shut tight, blinds drawn. The front door I once opened for trick-or-treaters and birthday parties now looked closed in a way that wasn't just physical. Closed to me. A bolt of cold shock ran through my spine as I realized I didn't have keys. I'd left them on the foyer table, trusting I'd be back by Sunday night like always. The keys didn't matter anymore, did they? My son Brandon and his wife Natalie had been distant lately, but I chalked it up to stress, work, parenting. Natalie was freelancing now, trying to build a lifestyle brand from home, and I knew she'd been complaining about not having enough space. But this? I turned to the taxi driver, who was looking at me with polite discomfort, as if he'd walked into a domestic drama mid-scene. "I'm sorry," I murmured. "Could you just leave them here for now?" He nodded and drove away. I was alone. Rain had been teasing the Seattle sky all morning, and now the first cold drops landed on my hands. I bent down and ran my fingers along the zipper of the suitcase I knew held my keepsakes. Old photos, my wedding album, the necklace my mother gave me on my wedding day. Natalie had packed these, touched them, sorted them into luggage as if they were just things, not pieces of my soul. I tried calling Brandon, straight to voicemail. I stood there, a 62-year-old woman who had paid the mortgage for a house she no longer legally owned, who had cooked dinners for a family that now saw her as an obstacle, a nuisance to be relocated. I should have seen this coming. It was all there. The signs, like bruises I refused to press. Last Christmas, when they rearranged the living room while I was visiting Joan, my best friend. They'd moved my recliner to the garage without asking. When I protested, Natalie had smiled tightly and said, "We're just modernizing things." Elaine. The weekend before I left for Napa, she'd made an offhand comment about a cool shed studio she'd seen on Pinterest. I laughed, assuming it was a dream board thing. Apparently, the dream had become mine. Or my nightmare. I walked around the side of the house, past the flower beds I'd nurtured for years, to the garden shed. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a twin mattress on a plastic frame, a flimsy IKEA nightstand with a lamp, and a clothing rack. My coats and sweaters were lined up on it, like the wardrobe of someone temporarily crashing, not living. Boxes were stacked in one corner, mismatched cardboard with Sharpie labels, Elaine's books, Mom's misc, old lady dishes, old lady. The term hit me like a slap. I sat on the mattress, staring at the walls. The insulation was poor. The floor was concrete. There was no heat, no bathroom, no connection to the home I'd lived in for over 3 decades. And this box, was now where I could stay. I opened my phone. Still no call back from Brandon. A new message blinked in. Mom, don't be dramatic. Natalie needs space for her studio, and we thought this would be a peaceful spot for you. It's temporary. Temporary. I was being given a timed corner of the property I'd built with my husband from the ground up, reduced to a basement-level guest in the shed out back. I thought about calling my sister again. I thought about calling a hotel. But my hand moved to a name I hadn't dialed in months. Joan Miller. Elaine? She answered instantly. What's wrong? I couldn't speak. Tears were already falling. Finally, I choked out the words. They put me in the shed. There was silence. Then, I'm coming. Pack what you need. You're not staying there. Joan arrived an hour later in her dented Subaru, her eyes scanning the bags like a seasoned lawyer assembling evidence. Unbelievable, she said. Get in the car. I hesitated, turning back to the shed. The finality of walking away hadn't set in yet. Not until I saw Natalie peeking through the upstairs window, watching us. Not until my phone buzzed again with a text. You didn't have to make this so dramatic. We gave you space. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned toward the street and climbed into Joan's car. As we pulled away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Rage. It simmered below the sadness, under the numbness, hot and steady. Something had cracked inside me, a fault line of pain, pride, and betrayal. I had spent so long trying to be accommodating, trying not to be a burden, trying to blend in. And where had it gotten me? Outside. In the rain. Watching my own family shove me aside like clutter. As Joan drove, she reached over and squeezed my hand. They don't know who they're dealing with, do they? I smiled faintly, through the ache. No, I said, but they're about to. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever felt invisible, undervalued, or discarded, I hope you'll stick with me. This is just the beginning of Elaine's journey. And trust me, the ending, you won't want to miss it. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next part of this story. It helps us keep creating powerful, emotional stories, just like this one. Your support makes all the difference. Quick question for you, comment below. If you were in Elaine's shoes, what would you have done the moment you found the note? A. Go inside and confront them immediately. B. Leave quietly and figure out a plan later. Comment your answer below, A or B. The ferry ride from Seattle to Bainbridge Island felt like crossing into another version of my life, one where I still had choices. The water shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun, waves rolling gently as seagulls called overhead. I sat beside Joan in the passenger seat of her Subaru, holding my coat tightly around me as if that alone could keep me from unraveling. My suitcases were in the back, the same ones that had sat on my sidewalk less than 24 hours ago. That image, those perfectly placed bags, that smug little note, still burned behind my eyes like an afterimage I couldn't blink away. Joan kept one hand on the wheel and the other on her thermos of coffee, the kind she always brewed too strong. She hadn't pushed me to talk. She didn't need to. We'd known each other since college, since before marriage, before motherhood, before life twisted and folded us into shapes we hadn't planned for. Sometimes the presence of someone who remembers who you used to be is more healing than any words. Still want to do this? She asked as the ferry neared the dock. I don't know, I answered honestly. But I can't go back. Her nod was small, but resolute. Then we build forward. Joan's house sat tucked beneath a canopy of cedar trees, perched on a gentle slope that overlooked the bay. It smelled like old wood, lavender oil, and lemon soap, the way a home should smell. Not sterile and curated like Natalie's influencer approved. Kitchen, but lived in, warm, real. She showed me to the guest room, a cozy nook with patchwork quilts, a wide window seat, and books stacked in comforting disorder. I sat on the bed, running my fingers along the stitching, trying to process the speed at which my entire world had come undone. Joan brought in a mug of tea and placed it beside me. "I called David," she said, sitting across from me. "My nephew. He's a lawyer now, specializes in elder rights and property disputes." "Elder rights?" I repeated. The phrase hit my pride like a slap. "Don't start," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You're not old, you're experienced, and you're being taken advantage of." I looked down at my hands. My wedding band was still there, though. Richard had been gone for 3 years. He would have been furious, not just at what Brandon and Natalie had done, but at me, too, for letting it happen so slowly, for shrinking so small inside my own home. I used to be someone. Not famous or loud, but known, valued. I was the librarian who organized reading nights for children, who knew every regular patron's birthday, who kept extra gloves in her desk for the kids who walked to school in the cold without them. I was the one who baked pies from scratch, who remembered to send cards to neighbors when their pets passed away. I was the woman who kept everything together when Richard got sick, who planned the funeral alone, who stood at the podium and told a church full of mourners that loving him had been the greatest privilege of her life. How did I end up here? That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up around 2 a.m., walked down to the kitchen in borrowed socks, and made myself toast. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound. It felt like being 19 again, sitting awake in a dorm room with 1,000 unspoken fears and too much time to think. I found one of Joan's old notebooks on the counter. She used it for grocery lists and reminders, but the last few pages were blank. Without thinking, I flipped to a clean page and began to write. I didn't start with the shed. I started with Richard. With the first time we toured the house in Green Lake, when he took my hand and said, "I can see us growing old here," I wrote about the garden we planted from scratch, about the ceramic frog by the pond that Brandon had painted as a child, the one Natalie later threw out because it clashed with the new design. I wrote until dawn. The next morning, I felt something I hadn't in days: clarity. Over breakfast, Joan handed me a pamphlet for the Bainbridge Island Garden Society. "They meet Tuesdays," she said casually, not pushing. "You might like it." I didn't answer, but I showed up anyway. The meeting was held in a sunlit community center with windows that looked out over a small park. A dozen women gathered around folding tables, trading seeds and clippings, laughing with the ease of people who had nothing to prove. I introduced myself awkwardly, unsure of how much to reveal. But when someone asked, "What brought you to Bainbridge?" I said it, out loud. For the first time, my son and daughter-in-law asked me to move into their garden shed. The room went still. Then one woman, gray braid, gardening gloves still tucked in her back pocket, said, "You're kidding." I wish I were. Another woman leaned forward, anger blooming in her expression. "Honey, that's elder abuse. Plain and simple." I didn't argue. I didn't need to. For the first time, I wasn't alone in my indignation. After the meeting, I stayed behind to help clean up. One woman, Susan, told me about how she'd left her husband of 38 years after he tried to force her into a care facility. "I wanted a divorce," she said, stacking chairs. "He wanted a live-in nurse who baked cookies." We laughed, but there was steel behind it, shared rage. Back at Jones, I called David. I told him everything: the payments, the verbal agreements, the signed-over title. The boxes labeled old lady dishes. He didn't promise miracles, but he promised movement. "That pattern of payment might give you grounds for an equitable lien," he explained. "You've essentially been financing a property you don't benefit from. That can be used." "What, about suing them?" I asked, my voice low. "Can I actually do that? You can, he said. But the real question is, do you want to? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. That evening, I walked with Joan down to the water. The air smelled like salt and pine, and the sun was melting into the horizon, turning the sky gold. We sat on a weathered bench near the shore, the kind where names are carved into the wood from decades of people trying to leave a mark. You think I'm weak? I said. She looked at me like I'd just spoken Swahili. I think you've been too strong for too long in all the wrong ways. The words hit so hard, I flinched. You've been strong in silence, in swallowing things you shouldn't have, in shrinking so others could spread out. That's not strength, Elaine. That's self-erasure. I didn't respond, but tears slipped down anyway. You get to be loud now, she added. You get to take up space. You've earned that. I looked out over the water and thought about the girl I used to be. The one who won debate team trophies and painted protest signs and kissed Richard in the rain. That girl didn't live in a shed. She didn't whisper to avoid conflict. She didn't disappear. She sure as hell didn't beg for space in a house she paid for. Something inside me clicked back into place that night. Not all at once. Not in a triumphant movie moment, but in a steady, quiet, grounded way, like a tree remembering its roots. The next morning, I woke up and signed the paperwork with David to begin the legal process. I also emailed the community, library, and offered to run a memoir writing workshop for women over 50. They said yes. I stood in Joan's guest bathroom, looking at my reflection, lines deeper, eyes heavier, but something else too. Something fiercer. Invisible is not who I am, not anymore, and I was just getting started. It took me 3 days to build up the nerve. 3 days of pacing Joan's sunlit kitchen with a mug of untouched coffee. 3 days of David walking me through documents and legal language I barely understood. And 3 nights lying awake replaying. Every word Brandon and Natalie had ever said that now sounded like quiet warnings. But the morning I stood at their door, my door, something inside me had settled. Not like dust or defeat. More like stone. Anchored. Steady. The garden looked exactly as I left it. Only worse. My dahlias had been ripped out. The flower bed I'd cared for like a child had been filled with ornamental grasses and white gravel. The kind of aesthetic Natalie's Instagram followers would call minimalist elegance. To me, it looked like grief. I rang the bell. The sound echoed back with a chill I'd never noticed before. This was the home where I'd once made pancakes, on Sundays, and danced barefoot in the kitchen with Richard, where Brandon had taken his first steps. Now I waited on the porch like a stranger, hoping not to be turned away. Natalie answered the door, all clean lines and clinical calm. Her makeup was perfect. Her smile wasn't. "Elaine," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "I'm not here for coffee," I said. "I need to speak with Brandon. Both of you." She hesitated. For a moment, I saw a flicker of unease, like she'd expected me to stay gone. "Of course," she finally said, stepping aside. The house smelled, like citrus candles and new wood polish. It was painfully sterile. As I stepped into the living room, I saw that the last of my photos had been taken down. Not a single picture of Richard remained. The walls were now covered in muted abstract art, the kind you buy when you want your life to look expensive but feel nothing. Brandon came in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked older than I remembered, not just from time, but from entitlement. A man grown soft by comfort, calloused only in the parts that should have stayed tender. "Mom," he said cautiously, like I was a glass of water he didn't want to spill. "You didn't say you were coming." "I didn't think I needed permission," I replied. An awkward silence stretched. "Let's sit," I said. Not a question. They sat on the sofa. I remained standing. I've stopped the mortgage payments, I said. Brandon blinked. What? 3 days ago. I called the bank. The payments are done. You'll need to cover next month yourselves. Natalie's eyes narrowed. Elaine, that's not... You've made it clear this is your house, I said, cutting her off. So take care of it. You don't get the title, the space, the power, and still ask me to be the bank behind the curtain. Brandon's voice rose slightly. That's not fair, Mom. We never asked you to keep paying. But you never offered to, I said. You knew. You both did. And you let me do it, every month quietly without acknowledgement, like I was footing the bill for my own exile. Natalie shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Brandon exhaled. Okay. Let's not turn this into a war. We can talk about how to make this work. Maybe we give you a little money every month for the payments. I don't want your money, I said. I want my dignity, which you stripped away the moment you packed up my life and moved it to a garden shed. Natalie's facade cracked for the first time. Elaine, you're blowing this out of proportion. That shed was temporary. No, it was a message, I said, stepping forward. You wanted to erase me, quietly, elegantly. No fights, no confrontation, just relocation. You gave me a corner so you could stretch. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it again. I've spoken to a lawyer, I continued. I've made payments on this property for over 2 years since signing over the deed. That constitutes financial interest. David believes I have grounds to place an equitable lien on the house. Natalie went pale. You can't sell the house unless I'm paid back. There it was, the real fear, the one that bloomed in her chest and flickered in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of losing the Oakwood Hills dream. The bigger house, the curated life. We were planning to tell you, Brandon said quietly, about selling. We just didn't want to worry you until things were finalized. Don't insult me, I said. You weren't protecting me. You were erasing me. Natalie stood up, arms crossed. So what now? You sue us? Drag your own family through court? I don't want to sue anyone, I said, but I won't be discarded. I won't let the woman who built this home, who kept it afloat, be reduced to a footnote. We gave you a place to stay, she snapped. You gave me a storage unit with a mattress. I stepped back, breath steady, voice clear. I'm giving you a choice. Sell the house to me, at the remaining mortgage balance. That's it. No profit. No penalties. I assume the mortgage, and you walk away with your credit, intact, or we let the courts decide what's fair. Brandon looked stunned. But it's our home, he whispered. Then you should have treated it like one, I said. The silence that followed was thick with things none of us wanted to say. Finally, I turned toward the door. I'll give you until Monday. Is this really what you want, Mom? Brandon asked, his voice soft. To burn the bridge? No, I said, pausing with my hand on the doorknob. But I won't be the only one building it. Back at Jones, I didn't cry. I made tea. I sat on the porch. I let the sky turn purple and the stars blink into existence. I let myself feel the gravity of what I'd done. And I waited for the fear to come. But it didn't. What came instead was something steadier. Not joy, not relief, conviction. Because I wasn't just fighting for a house. I was fighting for the right to be seen, to matter, to take up space. Not as a relic of someone's past, but as a woman with a present and a future. That weekend, I returned to the community library for the first session of the memoir writing workshop. I was nervous. I hadn't taught in years. But when I stood before those 12 women, each with their own story, their own silence, their own battles, I knew exactly what to say. We don't write just to remember. We write to reclaim. and you are not too old, too small, or too late to tell your story. The room went still. Then someone started writing, and I smiled, because maybe this was the beginning of a story where I got to be the author again. The first time I stepped behind the counter at Baylight Books, I felt strangely alive. It wasn't glamorous. The apron was stiff, the register temperamental, and my feet were already throbbing before lunch. But the smell of roasted coffee beans and old pages, the soft murmur of conversations and turning paper, it filled a void I hadn't realized had grown so cavernous. I wasn't just passing time. I was useful, seen, even if just to ring up someone's scone or recommend a novel they'd forgotten existed. The owner, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Rosa, had been hesitant when I applied. She'd glanced up from her receipts with raised eyebrows. "You've worked retail before?" "I was a librarian for over 30 years, I replied. "Different shelving, same people. And I waitressed through college." She'd paused for a beat, then handed me an application. 2 days later, I was back with a new black apron and a silent promise to myself. I wasn't here to hide. I was here to rebuild. Each shift grounded me, wiping tables, recommending poetry to college students who didn't know they needed it, smiling at tired mothers, lonely retirees, and chatty tourists. It wasn't just work. It was a lifeline. Something tethered and real. Something that didn't require permission from Brandon or approval from Natalie. It was mine. After work, I'd walk to the little community room at the Bainbridge Library and run the memoir writing workshop I'd started. I wasn't a therapist. I didn't have all the answers, but I gave women space to tell the truths they'd never spoken aloud. One woman wrote about a divorce she'd never told her children the full truth about. Another, about a miscarriage, her husband had brushed off as just bad timing. Every week, someone's voice grew louder, including mine. One night, after a long shift, I found Joan waiting outside the store. She leaned against her car, holding a bottle of wine and grinning. "You," she said, "look exhausted." "I am," I replied, and strangely proud of it. We drank on her porch that night, the bottle between us and the sea breathing softly in the dark. The stars felt closer than usual. "You've changed," she said gently. "I don't think Brandon would recognize you right now." "I'm not sure I recognize myself. Do you like her?" I thought for a long moment. Yes, I do. That night, lying in the guest bed, I opened my phone and saw Brandon's name blinking on the screen. Missed call. Voicemail. Then another. I hesitated. Then hit play. "Mom, we need to talk. The bank called about a lien? I don't understand what you're doing. Please call me back." I deleted it without listening to the rest. For once, he would wait for me. On my terms. Over the next week, I kept working, teaching, and writing. Rosa told me I had a natural rhythm for the place. She even let me pick the quote of the week to hang by the register. I chose something by Mary Oliver. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" I started bringing flowers from the garden club to decorate the front window. Customers commented. A little girl named Lily drew me a picture of Elaine's flower books. Rosa taped it to the counter. I carried that drawing home like it was gold. One Thursday afternoon, Brandon showed up. He stood just inside the doorway of Baylight Books, scanning the room like he wasn't sure he belonged there. He didn't. I saw him before he saw me. Still, wearing that same expensive watch, hair a little less styled, eyes darker. I walked over slowly. "Mom," he said, voice low. "Can we talk?" Rosa caught my eye and gave a small nod. "Take 15, she mouthed. We sat in a corner booth, the kind usually reserved for quiet readers and laptop freelancers. Brandon looked around, confused. You work here? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He rubbed his jaw. Natalie and we're in a bad spot. The bank said the lien complicates the sale. Our credit's taken a hit. We might lose the Oakwood Hills house. I sipped my tea. We need you to lift the lien and resume the mortgage. Just for a few months, until we sell. The audacity stung like a slap. I had imagined anger. But what I felt was worse. Pity. And what do I get in return? I asked calmly. We'll make sure you're taken care of, he said, as if offering some grand gesture. Taken care of? There's a senior community in Westbrook. It's really nice. I almost laughed. You think I want to be parked, somewhere, and visited on holidays? It's not like that. It's exactly like that. He flinched. I'm not doing this anymore, I said. If you want to sell the house, you sell it to me, at what's left on the mortgage, not a penny more. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. No, Brandon. What wasn't fair was 35 years of equity, of family, of love, traded in for a soundproof office and a Pinterest aesthetic. We had plans, he muttered. So did I. He leaned back. You're choosing a house over your family. No, I said. I'm choosing myself over being erased. His face hardened. What about Emma? And there it was. The dagger. You keep the lien. We don't see you. That's the truth, isn't it? I stared at him for a long time. The boy I used to rock to sleep had grown into a man who could weaponize a granddaughter. You really think this is who your father raised you to be? His eyes flickered. Shame, perhaps, or something like it. I'll think about it, I said quietly. But if you're serious, meet me at David Lee's office tomorrow, 2:00, with Natalie, and be ready to sign. The next day, I arrived early. David greeted me with warm eyes and sharp precision. He'd prepared everything. The contract was clean, concise, and firm. Brandon and Natalie walked in exactly at 2. Both dressed like they were headed into a negotiation. Not a reckoning, David slid the paper across the table. This is Mrs. Carter's proposal, he said. Brandon scanned it. Natalie snatched it from him halfway through. You want us to sell the house to you? At the mortgage balance? She said, voice rising. It's all you've invested, I said. No profit, no loss, just closure. That house is worth 3 times this. Then you shouldn't have packed up its owner. Brandon looked torn. You planned this. No, I said. I survived this. There's a difference. They stepped outside to talk. When they returned, Natalie's face was tight with fury. Brandon looked like something in him had broken. We'll sign, he said. But don't expect things to ever be the same. I don't, I replied. I expect them to be honest. When the ink dried and they left the office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt real. Later that night, back at Jones, we sat on the porch with tea instead of wine. The air smelled like cedar and evening salt. You're quiet, she said. I'm just breathing. You're allowed to rest, you know. Even warriors get tired. I'm not a warrior, I said. Joan smiled. You are now. In the distance, a ferry horn called out across the water. Tomorrow, the house would be mine again. But tonight, this moment, this peace, this porch, I belong to no one's schedule but my own. I unlocked the front door slowly, almost reverently, and stepped inside. It had been 3 months since the confrontation in David Lee's office, since Brandon and Natalie had signed the papers. 3 months of paperwork, signatures, inspections, and negotiations. 3 months of silence from my son, and 3 months of unlearning everything I'd let define me for far too long. The house was technically mine again now. No more verbal agreements. No more quiet, hidden transactions to keep the lights on. My name was on the title. I had the mortgage records, the lien release, the keys. And yet, as I stood inside that familiar hallway, it still didn't quite feel like home. Natalie had painted nearly every room in varying shades of trendy, cold grays and washed-out whites. The walls that once held warmth now felt like the inside of a staged catalog. Even the scent had changed. The place smelled faintly of lemon-scented floor polish and manufactured stillness. But it was mine. I walked through each room slowly, running, my fingers along the surfaces, pausing at places that once held laughter, argument, music, or tears. I stood in what had once been the dining room and remembered Richard pulling out my chair every evening, without fail, no matter how tired he was. I stood at the window in the living room and saw Brandon's 6th birthday party flash through, my memory like a flickering reel. Balloons, cake, Richard holding the camera, and me trying not to cry because our roof had just started leaking. But the party had to go on. Upstairs, the master bedroom had been gutted of every familiar piece. Natalie had converted it into a minimalist guest space, with sleek furniture and zero personality. I set my overnight bag on the bed, the one I'd brought from Joan's house, and just sat there for a moment, my hands on my knees, listening to the stillness. It wasn't loneliness. It was quiet ownership. That first night, I barely slept. I wandered the halls like a ghost revisiting the past, and when I did sleep, I dreamed of Richard. Not as he was near the end, pale and breathless, but younger, laughing, sunburned from too much gardening. In the dream, he handed me a seed, just one, and said, "Start again." The next morning, I opened every window. I let air back in. I let myself back in. I spent the first week unpacking slowly. Not just belongings, but memory. I returned photos to the mantle. Richard fishing in Montana, Brandon playing with Emma in the park, me holding a pie too big for the plate, and laughing so hard my eyes were shut. I hung quilts back on walls, placed books in the shelves in the order I liked. Not alphabetical, but by the rhythm of color and spine size. There wasn't enough money to renovate the way Natalie had, but that didn't matter. My power wasn't in new tiles or imported faucets. It was in the small things. The yellow kettle on the stove, the old rocking chair that squeaked in the exact same spot, the soft throw blanket Joan had given me years ago that still smelled like lavender. I didn't hear from Brandon, not even a text. I wasn't surprised. One Saturday, I was planting tulip bulbs in the front garden when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. I turned to see Brandon's car. He stepped out slowly, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His hair was longer, his face unshaven, his usual polished look replaced with something quieter, something humbled. "The flowers look nice," he said, almost in a whisper. I nodded, brushing dirt from my gloves. "Your father loved tulips." He looked around the yard. "I remember. He planted them every fall." I didn't answer. I didn't trust the space between us yet. "We didn't get the Oakwood Hills house," he said finally. "Our credit didn't hold. We're renting now, a small apartment." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, even if I wasn't sorry for the choices that led them there. He hesitated, eyes scanning the garden. "Natalie's pregnant. Again. Due in January." I let the silence sit for a moment before replying. "Congratulations." He looked up. "Emma asks about you. She doesn't understand why we don't come here anymore." I paused, dirt still under my fingernails, heart tight. "She's welcome here anytime," I said. "So are you." Brandon looked away. "I've been thinking about everything, about what happened." I waited. "I'm not saying we handled it right," he said. "But you chose a house over your family." The words fell heavy between us. I didn't choose a house, I said softly. I chose not to disappear. He frowned, but didn't interrupt. I chose not to be tolerated in the background of a life I helped build. Not to be a relic. I chose myself, Brandon. Because I had to. And maybe that looks like betrayal from where you're standing. But from where I was, it looked like survival. He looked down at his shoes, dusty from the gravel. I thought you were okay with it, he said quietly. That you didn't mind. I minded, I replied. I just got too tired to keep saying it. He nodded slowly. Emma would love to visit, if that's okay. It's more than okay. He gave a faint smile, then turned to go. Halfway to the car, he stopped. I'm sorry, he said, without looking back. I know that's not enough. It wasn't. But it was something. He drove away, and I stood in the garden, the wind rustling the leaves, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. Not from grief, but from the delicate hope that maybe, someday, we'd both find our way back to each other. That night, I hosted a small dinner in the backyard. Joan came, of course, along with Rosa from Baylight Books, and David and his wife. We sat at a picnic table under strings of soft yellow lights, the same kind Richard had once hung for a summer party. We ate too much, drank good wine, and told the kind of stories that make your stomach ache from laughing. At one point, Joan stood up and clinked her glass. A toast, she said, to Elaine Carter, who reminds us all that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Everyone raised their glasses. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the guests gone, I sat alone on the porch swing, wrapped in a shawl. The stars overhead blinked softly in the navy sky, and the creaks of the old wood beneath me were familiar now, like a lullaby. I thought of the woman I had been just months before, standing in the rain beside 4 suitcases on a sidewalk. Lost. Forgotten. Discarded. And now here I was, not saved by someone else, not rescued, reclaimed. This house wasn't just a house. It was the place where I became myself again. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't waiting to be asked or invited or needed. I was here. I was whole. And I was home. Elaine Carter's story isn't just a tale of betrayal or family conflict. It's a story of awakening, of rediscovery, of a woman long dismissed stepping back into her own life with courage, clarity, and conviction. Over the course of 5 chapters, we witness the quiet unmaking of her role within her own family, and then the powerful rebuilding of her identity, one choice at a time. What began with a trip to visit her cousin and a return to find her belongings left on the sidewalk was not just a cruel act. It was a rupture. A jarring break from the life she thought she had. Her son Brandon and daughter-in-law Natalie didn't throw her out with malice in the traditional sense. Their actions were polished, subtle, socially palatable. But the message was clear. You no longer belong. This is what makes Elaine's story so heartbreakingly familiar. So many women, particularly mothers and widows, begin to feel invisible once they are no longer useful in conventional ways. Their presence is expected, but their needs are considered inconvenient. Their sacrifices are remembered when it's convenient, but their authority, their place, their voice, often quietly edited out. But Elaine didn't stay silent. She moved in, with her best friend Joan, a woman who reminded her of who she used to be, and more importantly, who she still was. Through Joan's support and the guidance of David, a lawyer with a deep understanding of her legal and emotional position, Elaine found footing in a storm of uncertainty. She stopped paying the mortgage on a house that had legally been transferred to her son, but one she had still been secretly financing out of guilt, love, and fear of being forgotten. Elaine's decision to reclaim that home wasn't about walls or windows. It wasn't about ownership on paper. It was about dignity. She had poured 35 years of love, labor, and memory into that house. She had built a life, buried a husband, and raised a child within those walls. She wasn't fighting for property. She was fighting not to be erased. What followed was a masterclass in quiet strength. Elaine got a job at a bookstore cafe, taught memoir writing at the local library, and slowly rebuilt a life that was entirely her own. Her confidence was not loud, but it was unwavering. She made it clear: respect is not something to be begged for. It is something to be expected, demanded, and enforced with action when necessary. When Brandon eventually returned, exhausted, humbled, and carrying the consequences of the choices he and Natalie had made, Elaine didn't gloat. She didn't seek revenge. She set boundaries. She offered compassion but didn't compromise. Her self-respect. She made it clear that relationships are earned, not inherited by title. The moment she bought back her house, on her terms, was not just a victory of legality. It was a homecoming of spirit. And when Brandon confessed that Emma, Elaine's granddaughter, missed her, she welcomed that connection. Because Elaine is not a woman of bitterness. She is a woman of boundaries, strength, and love that's no longer unconditional, it's intentional. Her story ends not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet sense of peace. Elaine returns to the home that never stopped being hers, not because of paperwork, but because of the life embedded in every floorboard and frame. She is no longer someone waiting to be included. She is the center of her own story. The lesson. What can we take from Elaine's journey? The deepest lesson is this: you are allowed to reclaim your space, your worth, and your story, no matter how late you think it is. Elaine reminds us that age does not diminish value, that kindness is not a license for others to exploit us, that being a mother or a wife or a giver should never cost us our voice. In today's world, we are often told that reinvention belongs to the young. Elaine proves otherwise. Reinvention can happen at 62, in a garden shed, in a bookstore cafe, or in a courtroom. It happens the moment you decide you are no longer willing to be small. If you've ever felt like you're being pushed to the edges of your own life, pause. Ask yourself, what would it look like if I chose to stand in the center again? Maybe it's setting a boundary. Maybe it's calling a friend. Maybe it's finally telling the truth. Whatever it is, know that reclaiming your life is not selfish. It's sacred. Elaine Carter didn't just reclaim a house. She reclaimed herself. And so can you. Interactive question. Comment below. If you were in Elaine's position, what would you have done when Brandon asked her to start paying the mortgage? Again? A. Forgive and help him for the sake of family. B. Stand your ground and protect your own peace. Comment your answer below. A or B, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And what about you? What do you think about Elaine's journey? Do you agree with her choices? Would you have done anything differently? Let us and the community know in the comments. Your voice matters here. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone in your life, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us and gives us the energy and motivation to continue sharing stories that stir the soul and remind us of what really matters. Let's keep these conversations going. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to reclaim your life.